At 73, Dorothy sat in her favorite armchair by the window, watching her neighbor struggle to carry groceries up the front steps. Something stirred in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. Just 6 months ago, that could have been her. Yet here she was, having just returned from her morning walk, feeling more energetic than she had in years. The difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't genetics. It was something far more profound that scientists and psychologists have been studying for decades. The hidden predictors that separate those who thrive in their golden years from those who merely survive. Dorothy's transformation began with a conversation that changed everything. Her daughter had visited, worried sick about her mother's declining spirits after her husband's passing 2 years earlier. "Mom, you're just different," she had said gently. "It's like you've given up on tomorrow." Those words hit harder than any medical diagnosis could have. Because deep down, Dorothy knew her daughter was right. She had been living each day as if it were borrowed time, shuffling through routines without purpose, avoiding challenges, and slowly disconnecting from the world around her. She was aging, yes, but she wasn't aging gracefully. She was simply aging. That's when Dorothy discovered something remarkable about life after 60. The research was clear. How long we live isn't just about our physical health or family history. It's about patterns we can actually control, subtle signs that either predict vitality or decline. Senior empowerment, she learned, wasn't about denying age. It was about understanding which behaviors and mindsets actually extend both lifespan and quality of life. The first sign surprised her most. It wasn't about exercise or diet, though those mattered. It was about something psychologists call future orientation. The simple act of making plans, setting goals, and believing tomorrow holds possibilities worth pursuing. Dorothy realized she hadn't made a plan beyond next week's grocery list in months. Independent living, the research showed, wasn't just about maintaining physical abilities. It was about maintaining emotional wisdom, the deep understanding that each stage of life offers unique gifts, not just losses. The studies were fascinating. Seniors who embraced this mindset didn't just live longer. They lived better, with sharper minds and stronger relationships right up until the end. As Dorothy delved deeper into the science, she discovered that longevity after 70 often came down to 8 specific predictors. Some were physical, yes, but others were surprisingly emotional and social. The way someone responded to setbacks, how they maintained friendships, whether they continued learning new things, even how they talked about their own aging process. What struck her most was how these weren't fixed traits. They were choices available to anyone willing to make them. Life after 60 could be a chapter of decline, or it could be a chapter of unexpected growth and purpose. Dorothy made her decision. She would not just read about these 8 signs, she would embody them. She started small, joining a community garden project and signing up for a pottery class she'd always wanted to try. She began reaching out to old friends and making new ones. Most importantly, she started seeing herself not as someone whose best days were behind her, but as someone whose wisdom and experience could create beautiful tomorrows. 6 months later, as she watched her neighbors struggle with those groceries, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The quiet confidence that comes from taking charge of your own aging story. But her journey was just beginning, because as Dorothy would soon discover, understanding these 8 predictors was one thing, but there was one sign in particular that would challenge everything she thought she knew about growing older. Chapter 2. The Weight of Yesterday. Dorothy's transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without confronting the ghosts she'd been avoiding for 2 long years. Life after retirement had been nothing like the golden years she and Harold had imagined during those late-night conversations over coffee, when they planned their travels and dreamed of lazy mornings together. The reality was that retirement had arrived with a cruel twist. Harold's diagnosis came just 3 months after his retirement party, and within 18 months, Dorothy found herself sitting alone in a house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, and too full of memories. The future they'd carefully saved for had evaporated, leaving her with financial security but emotional emptiness. "I don't know who I am anymore," she had confided to her sister Margaret, during one of their weekly phone calls. For 47 years, I was Harold's wife. For 32 years before that, I was raising children. Now I'm just Dorothy, and I'm not sure I remember who that is. This crisis of identity, Dorothy learned, was more common than she'd realized. Senior reflection wasn't just about looking back with nostalgia. It was about the difficult work of rediscovering yourself when the roles that defined you for decades suddenly disappear. The research showed that people who successfully navigated this transition shared certain characteristics, and Dorothy was determined to understand what they were. Her first revelation came while sorting through Harold's belongings, a task she'd been putting off for months. In his desk drawer, she found a journal he'd kept during his illness, pages filled not with complaints about his condition, but with observations about the nurses who cared for him, sketches of birds he watched from his hospital window, and lists of things he was grateful for each day. One entry stopped her cold. Dorothy thinks I don't see how scared she is, but I do. I wish I could tell her that watching her face light up when she talks about her garden is the most beautiful thing in my world right now. She has so much life left in her. I hope she finds it again. The words hit her like a physical blow. Harold had seen her potential even when she couldn't see it herself. But more than that, he'd noticed something she'd forgotten. How alive she felt when she was nurturing growing things, creating something beautiful from nothing. That night, Dorothy made her first real decision about finding purpose in her new life. She would reclaim her garden, but not just as a hobby. She would make it a testament to resilience, both the plants and her own. The next morning brought both hope and harsh reality. Standing in her overgrown backyard, Dorothy felt overwhelmed by the work ahead. Her body wasn't what it used to be. Her knees ached after just 20 minutes of weeding, and her energy flagged by mid-morning. The gap between her intentions and her physical capabilities felt insurmountable. This is exactly what the research warned about, she muttered to herself, remembering an article about how unrealistic expectations could derail seniors' efforts to rebuild their lives. Emotional resilience, she was learning, meant adapting to new limitations without abandoning dreams entirely. But Dorothy had an advantage she didn't fully appreciate yet: decades of problem-solving experience. As a nurse for 35 years, she'd learned to work within constraints, to find creative solutions when standard approaches failed. That same resourcefulness began emerging in her approach to aging. She invested in ergonomic tools, planned her garden work in shorter sessions, and most importantly, she stopped measuring herself against the person she used to be. Instead, she began measuring progress against where she'd been 6 months earlier, shuffling through days without purpose or joy. The breakthrough came when Dorothy decided to share her story with others. She started small, posting pictures of her garden's recovery on a local community board. The response surprised her. Other seniors reached out, sharing their own struggles with finding meaning after major life transitions. Some were dealing with health challenges, others with the loss of spouses or the end of careers that had defined them. Dorothy realized she wasn't just rebuilding a garden. She was cultivating connections. The community garden project she joined became more than a hobby. It became a support network of people navigating similar challenges. They shared not just gardening tips, but strategies for maintaining independence, stories of small victories, and honest conversations about the fears that came with aging. You know what nobody tells you about getting older? Dorothy confided to her new friend Rose, a retired teacher who was battling her own demons after losing her husband. It's not just your body that changes. It's having to rebuild your sense of self from scratch. And nobody prepares you for how terrifying that can be. Rose nodded knowingly, but also how liberating it can be once you get the hang of it. For the first time in decades, I get to choose who I want to be. That conversation planted a seed that would grow into Dorothy's deepest understanding about life after 70. The research was right about the predictors of longevity, but there was something the studies couldn't fully capture: the profound courage it took to reinvent yourself when everyone expected you to simply fade away. As Dorothy stood in her flourishing garden 6 months later, watching her neighbors struggle with those groceries, she understood that her journey was about more than just living longer. It was about proving to herself, and to the world, that the final chapters of life could be just as rich and meaningful as any that came before. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing, one predictor that would test everything she thought she'd learned about growing older gracefully. Chapter 3. The Mirror of Memory. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Dorothy was tending to her tomatoes. Her daughter Sarah's voice carried that carefully controlled tone that immediately put Dorothy on edge. "Mom, we need to talk about Grandma Ruth." Dorothy's 96-year-old mother had been living independently in her own home, stubbornly refusing any discussion about assisted living despite several concerning incidents. But this time was different. Ruth had been found wandering her neighborhood at 3 in the morning, confused and unable to remember how to get home. "She keeps asking for Dad," Sarah continued, referring to Dorothy's father, who had passed 15 years earlier. "And yesterday, she didn't recognize the home health aide we hired. Mom, I think it's time to consider other options." As Dorothy hung up the phone, she felt the ground shift beneath her carefully rebuilt confidence. Watching her mother's decline forced her to confront the reality she'd been avoiding. What if all her efforts to age gracefully were just postponing the inevitable? What if the 8 predictors of longevity meant nothing when genetics had other plans? That evening, Dorothy sat across from her mother at the kitchen table they'd shared thousands of meals at over the decades. Ruth's eyes held moments of clarity interspersed with confusion, like watching someone drift in and out of sleep. "I don't understand why Harold doesn't visit anymore," Ruth said suddenly, her voice carrying the hurt of someone who felt abandoned by a son-in-law she'd adored. Dorothy's throat tightened. "Mom, Harold passed away 2 years ago. Remember?" The look of fresh grief that crossed her mother's face was devastating. Ruth was experiencing the loss of her son-in-law for what felt like the first time, again and again. Senior reflection, Dorothy realized, could sometimes be a cruel gift when memory began to fail. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Ruth whispered, reaching for Dorothy's hand. "I keep forgetting the sad things. Maybe that's a blessing." That night, Dorothy couldn't sleep. She found herself studying her reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for signs of her mother's condition in her own features. The research she'd been reading about longevity predictors suddenly felt inadequate. None of the studies addressed the fear that haunted so many seniors. Losing yourself piece by piece while your body continued on. The next few weeks brought a crash course in the realities of aging that Dorothy hadn't prepared for. Navigating the healthcare system, researching memory care facilities, and having conversations about power of attorney and end-of-life wishes. Each decision felt like another step away from the empowering narrative she'd been building about her own aging journey. "I don't know how to do this," Dorothy confessed to Rose during one of their garden sessions. "I spent so much energy focusing on living well that I forgot to think about the other parts." Rose paused in her weeding, understanding immediately. "You mean the parts where we don't get to stay in control?" "Exactly. What's the point of all this research about emotional resilience and maintaining independence if it can all disappear anyway?" It was Rose who introduced Dorothy to something the scientific studies rarely emphasized: the difference between aging with dignity and aging with denial. "My grandmother always said that courage isn't about not being afraid," Rose shared. "It's about being afraid and choosing to love anyway." This wisdom hit Dorothy at her core. She realized she'd been approaching her own aging as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a human experience to be lived fully, including the uncertain and frightening parts. The breakthrough came during an unexpected moment with her mother. Ruth was having a particularly confused day, but suddenly looked directly at Dorothy with perfect clarity. "You know, dear," Ruth said, "I may not remember everything, but I remember that you were always the brave one. Even when you were scared, you kept going. That's what matters." In that moment, Dorothy understood something profound about the predictors of longevity that went beyond the research. It wasn't just about the habits that extended life. It was about the courage to remain open to love, connection, and growth even when the future became uncertain. But as she held her mother's hand, Dorothy knew her greatest test was still ahead. because there was one aspect of aging that all the preparation in the world couldn't fully shield her from. The letter arrived 3 days later, forwarded from an address Dorothy hadn't lived at in over 20 years. The return address made her hands tremble: St. Mary's Adoption Services. Inside, a carefully worded inquiry that turned her world upside down. My name is Catherine Walsh. I believe you may be my birth mother. I've been searching for 38 years. Dorothy sank into Harold's old chair, the letter shaking in her grip. Catherine, the name she'd whispered to herself in quiet moments for nearly 4 decades, wondering if the baby girl she'd given up at 17 had grown up happy, healthy, loved. The secret she'd carried through her marriage, through raising Sarah and her son Michael, through all the years of being the dependable nurse, the devoted wife, the reliable mother. She had been barely more than a child herself when she'd made that impossible decision. Her parents, strict and unforgiving, had sent her away to deal with the situation quietly. The father, a boy from her high school who disappeared the moment she told him, left her facing the choice alone. Keep the baby and watch both their futures crumble, or give her daughter a chance at the life she couldn't provide. Now, at 73, Dorothy faced a possibility she'd never dared imagine. Rediscovery after 60 wasn't just about finding yourself. Sometimes it was about finding the pieces of yourself you'd thought were lost forever. The timing felt cruel, just as she was learning to care for her mother's fading memory, just as she was building confidence in her own aging journey. This reminder of her youngest self arrived to shatter her carefully constructed peace. What would Sarah and Michael think? What would Harold have thought? She'd never told him about Catherine, convincing herself that some secrets were too heavy to share, even in marriage. Dorothy spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the letter, reading and rereading Catherine's careful words. I don't want to disrupt your life. I just need to know where I came from, who I am. If you're willing to meet, I'll be in town next week for a conference. If not, I understand. The emotional resilience Dorothy had been building through her garden work and community connections felt fragile now. This wasn't about adapting to physical limitations or finding new purpose in retirement. This was about confronting a choice that had shaped the entire trajectory of her life, and possibly having the courage to let it reshape what remained. When Dorothy finally called Sarah, her daughter's reaction surprised her. After the initial shock, Sarah's voice softened with understanding rather than judgment. Mom, you were 17. You did what you thought was best. Then, after a long pause, I always wondered why you seemed so sad on my birthday sometimes, like you were thinking about someone else. That conversation opened a floodgate Dorothy hadn't expected. New beginnings, she realized, sometimes required grieving the paths not taken before you could embrace the ones that lay ahead. She began to understand that her sister had been carrying some of this weight too, having been the only family member who knew about Catherine's existence. The day before Catherine's proposed meeting, Dorothy stood in her garden at dawn, surrounded by the life she'd coaxed from seemingly barren soil. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. Sometimes the most beautiful growth came from the most painful circumstances. Sometimes healing family bonds required acknowledging the ones that had been severed long ago. But as she prepared to face the daughter she'd given away, Dorothy wondered if some choices were too big to heal from, even with all the emotional wisdom that came with age. What if Catherine's presence didn't bring closure, but opened wounds that had never properly healed? What if the 8th predictor of longevity wasn't about what you embraced in your later years, but about what you'd been brave enough to face from your earliest ones? The coffee shop Dorothy chose was neutral territory, a place where neither of them held memories. She arrived early, her hands trembling as she ordered tea she wouldn't drink. When Catherine walked through the door, Dorothy's breath caught. There was Harold's gentle smile in her features, but Dorothy's own stubborn chin and the way she tilted her head when uncertain. Catherine moved with the careful grace of someone trying to contain a lifetime of questions. As she sat down, Dorothy noticed the small scar above her left eyebrow and wondered about the story behind it, about all the stories she'd missed. I need you to know, Catherine began, her voice steady but soft. I had wonderful parents. The Walshes gave me everything I needed. I'm not here because anything was missing. Dorothy felt something inside her chest release. Then why? She whispered. Because I became a mother myself 2 years ago. Catherine's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and I couldn't understand how anyone could give away their child until I held my daughter and realized how much you must have loved me to make that choice. The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. For 38 years, she'd carried the belief that giving Catherine away meant she'd failed as a mother before she'd even begun. But Catherine saw something entirely different. A teenage girl who'd chosen her daughter's future over her own immediate desires. I kept a journal the whole time I was pregnant, Dorothy found herself saying. I wrote you letters I never sent. I told you about the books I was reading, the songs I heard on the radio, the way you kicked when I ate ice cream. She paused, gathering courage. I told you how sorry I was that I couldn't be what you needed. Catherine leaned forward. You were exactly what I needed. You were brave enough to want more for me than you could give. This moment became Dorothy's life's turning point after 60. The shame she'd carried for nearly 4 decades began to transform into something unexpected, pride in a choice that had required more courage than she'd ever given herself credit for. Emotional closure, she realized, didn't always mean getting what you'd lost back. Sometimes it meant understanding that what you'd thought was loss had actually been love in its most difficult form. There's something else, Catherine said, pulling out her phone. I'd like you to meet your granddaughter. The screen showed a toddler with Dorothy's dark eyes and Catherine's smile, building a tower of blocks with intense concentration. Dorothy touched the screen gently. What's her name? Dorothy. We call her. The coffee shop seemed to blur around them as Dorothy understood the gift she was being given. Not just the chance to know Catherine, but the wisdom with age to see that her choice at 17 had rippled forward in ways she never could have imagined. Her granddaughter carried her name because Catherine wanted to honor the mother who'd loved her enough to let her go. The funny thing is, Catherine continued, researching longevity for my nursing degree led me to you. I kept finding studies about how people who face difficult choices with courage tend to live longer, healthier lives, even when those choices cost them dearly. She smiled. Turns out my birth mother was teaching me about resilience before I was even born. Dorothy finally understood the 8th predictor that had eluded her. It wasn't about avoiding difficult emotions or painful choices. It was about having the courage to face them fully, to let them transform you rather than diminish you. Her teenage pregnancy hadn't derailed her life. It had taught her the deepest lesson about love she'd ever learned, one that had made her a better nurse, a more compassionate friend, a stronger woman facing her mother's decline. As they sat together, 3 generations of women connected by choice rather than just circumstance, Dorothy realized that aging gracefully wasn't about maintaining who you'd always been. It was about having the courage to discover who you'd always been becoming. 6 months later, Dorothy stood in her garden with little Duck balanced on her hip, watching the 2-year-old point excitedly at every butterfly and bee. Catherine visited twice a month now, and each time brought new layers of understanding about the intricate ways life weaves itself together. Sarah and Michael had embraced their half-sister with the same warmth they'd inherited from their mother, and Dorothy marveled at how family could expand in ways she'd never imagined possible. The research about longevity predictors had led Dorothy down an unexpected path, but now she understood that the 8 signs weren't just scientific markers. They were invitations to live more fully at every stage of life. The first predictor she discovered, future orientation, had evolved from simply making plans to embracing the mystery of what tomorrow might bring. Her pottery classes had blossomed into a small business selling planters at the farmer's market. Her community garden had become a gathering place for seniors sharing their own stories of reinvention. Ruth's condition had continued to decline, but Dorothy approached her mother's care differently now. Instead of fighting the forgetting, she learned to meet her mother wherever she was each day. Some afternoons, Ruth thought Dorothy was her own sister. Other days, she asked about people who'd been gone for decades. But there were still moments of perfect clarity when Ruth would look at Dorothy with complete recognition and say, "You turned out exactly like I hoped you would." These timeless lessons about acceptance and presence have become Dorothy's greatest teachers. Senior resilience, she'd learned, wasn't about refusing to bend. It was about bending without breaking, about finding strength in flexibility rather than rigidity. The community she'd built around her garden had become a network of mutual support, each person contributing their own wisdom about navigating the complexities of aging. Catherine had become more than a reconnection with the past. She'd become a bridge to the future Dorothy was still creating. When Dot took her first steps, it was in Dorothy's living room, her tiny hands gripping her grandmother's coffee table for balance. When she spoke her first clear word, it was Nana, the name Dorothy had never thought she'd earn again. The eighth predictor of longevity, Dorothy now understood, was integration. Not the denial of difficult experiences, but the weaving of them into a coherent story that honored both the pain and the growth. Her teenage pregnancy, Harold's death, her mother's decline, her children's struggles, Catherine's return. Each thread had its place in the tapestry of her life. Dorothy's story had become something larger than personal transformation. The seniors in her community garden began sharing their own hidden chapters, their own moments of unexpected courage, their own discoveries about what it meant to age with dignity. Mrs. Patterson revealed she'd returned to school at 68 to become a literacy volunteer. Frank, the retired mechanic, had started teaching neighborhood kids how to fix bicycles. Rose had begun writing poetry about her late husband, turning grief into art. These were life's quiet victories, the ones that didn't make headlines but changed everything for the people living them. Dorothy realized that the research about aging had been valuable, but the real wisdom came from the lived experience of choosing courage over comfort, connection over isolation, growth over stagnation. On her 74th birthday, surrounded by her expanded family and chosen community, Dorothy made a toast. To the stories we're brave enough to write in the margins of our lives, she said, raising her glass. And to the family we create when we're finally ready to let ourselves be truly known. As laughter filled her home and Dot's delighted squeals punctuated the conversations, Dorothy understood that longevity wasn't just about adding years to your life. It was about adding life to your years, right up until the very end.